I have to start with a disclaimer. A recording of tonight's events will be made available to the public by our sponsoring organizations through their websites and social media. Other recordings of this event, whether they be in person or on a computer screen, may not be used without express written approval of the league. The league will allow only audio and video of this event to be broadcast in its entirety, except by the media reporting on the event. Our discussion tonight focuses on the school to prison pipeline, examining the roles of zero tolerance policies, police in schools, and other causes, as well as potential solutions for enabling all Utah students to graduate and thrive. We are so delighted to have as our moderator tonight, Rosie Nguyen, who is an award-winning journalist who joined the ABC4 News team as a reporter in January 2018. In September 2020, she embarked on a new journey as the anchor for CW30 News at 7 p.m. Although she's not out in the field anymore, Rosie is continuing her passion for social justice and community issues through the nightly In Focus discussions. Welcome, Rosie, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Shauna, and thank you everybody who is tuning in virtually. What a great event and what a great discussion. What a great topic that we're addressing. This is something that we could talk about for days, weeks, and months. And here we are trying to brush the surface of it in an hour. So thank you all for being here tonight. I would like to start with talking a little bit about the topic at hand. So Diplomas Not Defendants, breaking the school to prison pipeline in Utah schools. So the school to prison pipeline is a disturbing state and national trend wherein children are funneled out of public schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice system. So data from the University of Utah, it shows that children with disabilities are twice as likely to be disciplined at school as their non-disabled peers. Their students with disabilities are twice as likely to be disciplined at school as their non-disabled peers, and children of color are 1.5 to 3.5 times more likely to be disciplined than white children. So rather than receiving the additional educational and counseling services that they need, children with learning disabilities or histories of poverty, abuse, or neglect are often isolated, punished, and expelled. So tonight we're going to explore, right, the how, the why, what's next, with our amazing panelists tonight. So I would like to introduce our four panelists tonight. I'm going to start with Mindy Holmdahl. Mindy Holmdahl has worked in education for more than 20 years. So currently Mindy is a director of student services at the Salt Lake City School District. She oversees the Utah State Board of Education, Gang Prevention and Intervention Grant, and is the liaison to the Salt Lake Police Department School Resource Officers. The Student Services Department also supports school counselors, district social workers, district nurses, and students receiving McKinney-Vento support. Our second panelist tonight is Toyah Reynolds, who is a recovery advocate. So Toyah, let's see here. Toyah Reynolds was born and raised in Ogden, Utah. He was first incarcerated at 8 years old and spent the next 25 years in and out of prison. Toyah was released 3 years ago. He has successfully completed his parole and looks forward to helping others after their incarceration. Our third panelist is Pamela Vickery. Pamela Vickery serves as the executive director of the Utah Juvenile Defender Attorneys. Pamela has been instrumental in several sweeping reforms in Utah, including serving on the committee that developed Utah's Juvenile Competency Statute, legislation that requires automatic appointment of counsel in all delinquency cases from the first hearing through termination of court jurisdiction, shackling reform, eliminating juvenile life without parole, modifications to transfer laws, extension of court jurisdiction, raising the age, and an omnibus juvenile justice reform. Our fourth and final panelist tonight is James Yapias. James is an educator who is committed to implementing research-based school reform initiatives that empower teachers, students, and their families. He has extensive experience as a turnaround principal with low-performing schools, as he was instrumental in improving student performance at several Title I schools. James currently serves as a director of development in the Salt Lake City School District, and he is the executive director of the Salt Lake Education Foundation. James serves also as the education chair for the NAACP Salt Lake branch and NAACP Tri-State Conference of Idaho, Nevada, and Utah. So we have very qualified, very intellectual group of panelists tonight, and we look forward to hearing from all of you. So I would like to start with our prepared questions now. So we have a set of 3 questions that we will pose to all of our panelists. And we would like this to be very organic, very natural, very discussion-based. So yes, I will direct the question to each person at one point or another. But if you hear something that your fellow panelist says and you would really want to follow up with that, feel free to jump in and say, hey, Toyah, I want to follow up with that. Or Pam, that was a very great answer. I'd like to chime in. Feel free to do that. It's not going to be so cookie cutter, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, 2, 1. So with that, the first question of our panel tonight is, in your opinion, what are the key causes of the school to prison pipeline? So really big question, right? Toyah, let's hear from you first. What do you think are the key causes to the school to prison pipeline?
Well, I think that the people become a product of their environment. And so because of that, the outside influences that they're not getting at home.
Pam, what about you? What do you think are some of the key causes of the school to prison pipeline?
So I'm coming at this perspective from representing young people in juvenile court with delinquency offenses. And what we see is that there is a direct connection between school discipline and responses to school discipline and referrals to court. If you look back at research from like 2010 with the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention, of the youth that were surveyed that were in an out-of-home placement, 58% of them had had some type of school suspension or expulsion or school discipline before being involved in the juvenile justice system. In 2016, Impact Justice did research that showed that 9 of 10 young people that are involved in the juvenile justice system were involved in some type of school discipline before their court involvement. So you see a pattern of how we handle school discipline that escalates to the point of a reliance or an over-reliance on involvement from the courts. And so a lot of what we've been talking about for the last several years is that the court can't be our solution to all discipline problems. Certainly we need safety in our schools, and we need to be able to address certain types of behaviors that may result in some referrals to the court system. But the court system can't be the response for discipline type problems. And what we saw in past years is that there had been a real shift of moving discipline type responses towards court responses and using the court as that response rather than using evidence-based interventions in the schools like restorative justice things and other types of ways to deal with young people. And I think we also need to really look at how that aspect of disruption in schools and academics, like through suspensions and expulsions, impacts kids' socio-emotional and educational development and may ultimately impact some of the behaviors that result in them being brought to the juvenile justice system.
James, let's hear from you next. What do you think are some of the key causes of the school to prison pipeline?
Well, I think a couple of things that we have to keep in mind. I know Pam shared information about the research that was done in 2010. But if we look at history, the way the students have been working in school, attending school, and having difficult time at times with discipline, that's been one of the biggest issue. I know we talked about restorative practices, so we are able to early identify students that need help rather than send them to court. I think our goal is, what we have seen over time is that a lot of the safeguards to help students navigate this, the school system, and even, when they're out of school, has not been in place. In many instances, we've criminalized a lot of students to the juvenile court, and I think having this opportunity, this dialogue, to be able to see how we can do restorative practices and really provide opportunities for our students to learn, and to have opportunities for them to also have safeguards in place. As educators, we have to do a little bit better in providing that support for them. So there are multiple factors that really impact. It could be family, community, school, all different aspects. And research has shown that, students are not just getting in trouble in the schools, also in after-school programs with all the free time that they have, and constructive time. But at the same time, what happens is when they go home and they get in trouble and they have that extra free time, many of our students have had that difficult time throughout the country, and so I think that's something to keep in mind as far as what has contributed to the school to prison pipeline.
Thank you, James. Mindy, let's hear from you. What do you think are some of the key causes of the school to prison pipeline?
Well, thank you for having us here tonight. Appreciate the opportunity to speak about this. As Pam and James both referenced, in 2016, the Utah Juvenile Justice Working Group report aimed at identifying issues and to improve outcomes in the juvenile justice system was sent out to districts all across the state. And it indicated that most youth who enter the system are low-level offenders. Formerly, there was this thing called unlawful acts in a school, and it was a citation that school resource officers could issue for all types of behavior code of conduct issues, things like maybe writing on a desk, or being disrespectful even, or things that now we do strive to address through restorative and trauma-informed lens. And once youth got those tickets, they could go through the system and have different things, in terms of like, okay, a judge or somebody might say, okay, now you have to get good grades. You have to attend every day. You have to, next time I see you, I want to see all of this progress. And when kids couldn't achieve that progress, then it would cause them to go further into the system. So a small issue could snowball into getting further and further into the JJS system. And that's what this report was doing. Representative Lowry Snow and a group of other legislators, as they worked on this report, Sandra Hollins writing restorative practice like resolutions, specific legislation, turned around that issue so that SROs were no longer writing unlawful acts in a school citations. And, it mandated training for school resource officers and administrators, and different things to really impact the change because of what we saw in that report.
I think I want to, if you don't mind, I also wanted to add what Mindy's mentioning. When we talk about zero tolerance policies, for years that many districts throughout the country have implemented, which means that any misbehavior or violation of school rules, no matter how minor they may be, at times they've taken to the extreme where students were cited and first introduced into the juvenile justice system. Expulsions are normal and commonplace in dealing with misbehavior at times. When we talk about just suspensions, but if it goes to the extreme of expulsions for disrespect, and depending who's handling the situation, that can be escalated. Now, nationally, we've seen that type of research done by the ACLU and other organizations, and we've seen that across the board, I think that the zero tolerance policy meant that anything that was a misbehavior or violation of the school was going to get some sort of a consequence for their behavior.
Rosie, do we have time for me to just chime in? I know, can I chime in?
I love this. I love the organic jumping in. You want to jump in, by all means, please, Pam.
So I think another thing with Mindy and James talking about this that is really important to consider is, what is the role of a school resource officer in our schools? And if you look at historically, school resource officers were brought in to be really more of that a community type piece, or a community intervention type piece Mr. Yapias is talking about, right? To like provide an additional support or something like that to young people. But then throughout the 90s, what we saw is really this shift of moving towards school safety type issues. And then school resource officers are employed usually through local law enforcement agencies. And so that training came from local law enforcement agencies and not through the lens of education, which is why what Mindy referenced with Representative Holland's legislation about training for school resource officers is so important. But I think that we have to continue to ask ourselves, what is the role of a school resource officer, and how do we want to be implementing that? There was a survey that was completed by Libertas Institute in 2020, I think, that showed that 60% of Utahns don't believe that police should be present in K through 12 schools. I think, you know, and I don't want to say that there hasn't been, we've had, certainly in discussions with the legislature, we've had examples of the ways that school resource officers have been involved in trying to engage more through like a community perspective, and engaging with young people and things like that. But I think something that might be really important for us to consider is, can't we still engage local law enforcement as that resource for our schools without necessarily having them in the schools? Because the data with regards to school resource officers does show that schools that have school resource officers nationally have about 5 times higher referrals to court than schools without SROs. I know that we've made a lot of progress, as Mindy said, with regards to our training and things like that. But I think that we really have to consider that, and consider if that's their best use of resources, or if we don't need to have more family support, educational supports, mental health supports for our young people. Especially in today's climate, and with things that we've been struggling with just even in the past 2 years, with kids, you know, being out of school and then trying to come back into school after being kind of socially isolated and things like that, and seeing some of those tensions, and whether or not we wouldn't be better served by having some different types of interventions for young people.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, just as that liaison to our school resource officers, I mean, in response to that report, we really changed practices, and that we intentionally worked to increase those positive contacts, to build relationships among SROs and our students and our families, and having those ongoing trainings and evaluations and assessments of our data. And it's an important question in terms of the resources and our mental health resources. And I feel like there is a healthy balance on the opposite end of the spectrum, seeing kids who have a relationship with the school resource officer that might never call 911, a student who might be a dreamer or DACA, or their family is in a situation where they would feel fearful of calling just your regular law enforcement, but can access a school resource officer for to answer questions and get some support and make a report in a way. And then also as preventing students from getting in trouble. It's such a complex issue, and it is so difficult. And I do just want to shout out that I know our resource officers have really taken these reports seriously and the training seriously, and are really trying to do right by our students and community.
Thank you so much, everyone. I love the engagement of that discussion. Let's move on to question number 2. Question number 2. Let's talk about, this is a question that I'm not necessarily going to direct to each of you, but I want to pose it, and whoever wants to jump in first can jump in first, and then we'll just kind of snowball it and see how it goes. So I'm wondering, why do you think the school to prison pipeline is an important issue to understand, whether that's long-term consequences, whether that's an issue that's not being discussed well enough in common society or in media? Anyone want to kind of take the head lead on that first?
I will. So I know for me, the prison, when I was a kid, it was like a rite of passage for me to end up going to prison. And so there wasn't really enough, people reinforcing things and letting us know, that we had any other choice. And that's just like from my personal experience. And because of that, they end up they end up coming in a rebellious state. Okay. And because of that, I'm just a little nervous right now, so I'm sorry. But anyway,
You're doing
they
great,
come in a
Toyah.
rebellious state. They don't think that they have any other alternative. And once you don't have any hope, then the next step is to follow the course that was written for you.
Toyah, thank you so much for sharing your personal experience. Could you kind of elaborate when you were talking about, going to prison was kind of a rite of passage? I'm guessing that was part of your environment. Would you be willing to elaborate on that a little bit more, since you're sharing a personal experience with all of us?
Okay, so a rite of passage would be more so like everybody in the neighborhood that I grew up in, they was going to prison, their dads and stuff like that. So you automatically have that mark on you. And when you don't have any other people influencing you, and you just look at these people constantly, then pretty soon you believe in that's what your course of life is supposed to be.
Thank you for elaborating on that. I was just wondering if it meant that like it was sort of like a badge of pride. Like I didn't know in the neighborhood that I grew up in. I grew up in the west side of Salt Lake City, Glendale, right? And for some, going to prison was street cred. But for you, describing it as a rite of passage was kind of interesting, because it's, not for everybody is that seen as like a badge of pride. It is almost seen like a stepping stone in life, because they're seeing everybody in their surrounding environment going through that. So I love that you talked about that and how that experience is sort of different and means something different for each individual.
Yeah, well, like I say, it is, you could say it's a badge of honor, but the thing about it though is the rite of passage to me was, I knew that my future was already doomed. I already knew it was already written before I even had a chance to even understand it. And because it was already written, I stride towards making that rite of passage a real thing.
I would say that, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is the impact that from the minute that the student hits the juvenile justice system, the experience that they have to go through, confusion, stress, depression, anger, as a result of everything that they're traumatized. Then that's their first experience that they're given to as they go through the system. And and why it persists is because I think a lot of us in education and also in the juvenile justice system, we need to do a better job in doing more prevention, providing opportunities for our students and our families, and providing support for our parents. There are many young parents, many times that they need that extra support, guidance. I wish I could say as a parent I have all the answers, but I think all of us are constantly, we always ask the why. Why does it happen? And I think we're all learners, and we're still learning about how to become better parents at times. And so Why does this continue to persist in our juvenile justice system? Is because I think we at times think that we have arrived in addressing the issue, but it's a systemic issue. It's something that we need to continue to provide training, support for staff, for police officers. I've had a tremendous experience with our resource officers during the pandemic and prior to that, where we were doing home visits, meeting with parents and meeting with students at a different level. But that requires commitment from everyone, from leadership, from anyone that's working with students and has first contact with the students and parents. And I think that's something that it persists because it comes and goes. We think at some point we've resolved or we're addressing things are getting better, and then we let our guard down. But this is something that we have to constantly nurture and constantly support. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we all face in addressing this systemic issue.
Yeah, I agree with James. Partnering with families, partnering with students, talking to them about their experiences, hearing from the stakeholders who have been impacted about, what was needed, what could have made an impact, what could have changed a trajectory. We, are constantly trying to work toward that. Like James mentioned, that, our education foundation through the, is it a basic needs? Is it food? Is it shelter? The, homeless population in Salt Lake, the housing prices in Salt Lake. There are so many things that, COVID, all of these things that have impacted our families. And how can we meet healthcare basic needs? How can we get to have a foundation and hear from our stakeholders kind of what are those next steps? And truly, we do have some school and family collaboration leaders and are striving to make these connections, but having the stakeholders at the table and leading out in terms of us being able to make these changes and is counselors and additional social workers and that one adult, going back to Toyah, one adult who there's research after research that says, one positive adult mentor can change the trajectory for students. So trying to make space for that in all of our schools and in all of our classrooms is something that we're, always working toward.
I would just chime in with that to say that as we're talking about, like Mr. Yapias referring to looking at the history of these types of things, when we've looked at striving to always do better, and then you do one step forward, and then kind of it's very easy to fall back into this is kind of an easier approach, or this seems like the easier answer or something like that. But one of the things that I think is so important to me when we're talking about the school to prison pipeline is understanding a lot of what Toyah is talking about, right? Like the expectation that was set early on for a community, or that we're setting for our young people, or what traumas and impacts are we having with our responses, right? So when we're looking at school to prison pipeline stuff, one of the things that you're looking at is what are the impacts, like I said, on social, emotional, and educational health and things like that. And when you see youth who have been stopped at school for justice related or juvenile justice reported offenses and things like that, they reported that they have more emotional distress during the interaction, that they continue to have social stigmatization after the stop, and that they have trauma after the stop when the youth has interactions that have occurred within the school setting. And so we're creating a pattern of trauma for our young people by interacting through only one lens versus through looking at a lens of how can I help you? What is it that you need? How can I effectively engage with you? Not necessarily always stepping in from this perspective of someone needs to stop, someone needs to discipline, someone needs to, I mean, we need to do that, but we need to do that through talking with young people. Like Mindy is saying, it's that one positive person, but it takes one positive person that's willing to stop, pause, listen. And I think that because, like I said, we've really got to be cognizant of that we're getting all of this research that's showing that this type of over-policing or referrals to using the criminal justice system as the funnel to deal with behaviors for young people is creating a lot of mental health stress and physical trauma with regards to our communities.
I think, go ahead, Mindy.
Oh, sorry. And I was just going to add, yeah, and opportunities to repair harm. And when we're talking about kids whose prefrontal cortex isn't developed, who are making kind of more, they're at these stages of life where risky behavior is very common just in terms of development, and making sure that, people surround them and give them opportunities to build those connections, to understand how behaviors might have impacted another, to have a pathway to be, back in the classroom, even if something, did go not so well for them. Those restorative practices and processes just to have an exponential difference in terms of changing a kid's trajectory. Sorry, go ahead, James.
I think we also have to ask ourselves, why do we have an overrepresentation and punishments of higher rates of suspension of underrepresented or minority students in the legal system? I think the bigger picture is what is the intent and what is the impact when that happens of a certain population of, for example, African Americans, Black students in the national U.S. At the national rate, they were basically overrepresented in jails, in also correctional facilities, and we got to ask ourselves, why does that happen, and what can we do to prevent from that happening at the national level? And not just with Black, but you're talking about Indigenous students. And so as we're looking at these different populations, we have to be able to have better trained, not only teachers, counselors, probation officers, police officers, so that we can better understand and really reduce the number of overrepresented students or youth in the juvenile justice system as it relates to the minority population.
James, I actually think that answer is a great segue to our next question, since we're speaking about these disparities that we're seeing amongst communities of color. So our next question is, data indicates that racial disparity exists in the juvenile system from the point of arrest through incarceration. So this is a two-part question. A, how have you seen the manifestation of this in your work or life? And B, why do you think it continues to persist? So I'd love to throw this question out, and whoever would like to take it first, please feel free to jump in.
Well, I'll start from my perspective with the court system. Yes, we have in Utah data that shows that we have an overrepresentation of youth of color within the juvenile justice system. And what the data shows is that we have a disparity at the very beginning of the entry into the juvenile justice system, and that disparity increases as kids get deeper and deeper into the juvenile justice system. And although we've had great successes with our juvenile justice reform, a lot of what Mindy was talking about earlier in 2016 with Representative Snow, 2017 with the passage of that, where we changed a lot of the ways that we interact, looking at how we're disciplining and interacting with our young people. We've seen a lot of successes with decreased detention rates, improved quality of non-judicials or diversions from the court system and things like that. But what we have not been able to see is an improvement in our overrepresentation of youth of color, that disparity has continued to grow. And so I think we have to continue to look at that. And the real thing that we have to look at is that the research suggests that with racial disparities, we have to be very clear and very very clear when we're addressing this issue that it's not caused by more misbehavior, but it's due in part to enforcement practices. And I know that that makes all of us uncomfortable, and it makes people feel like they're being called out, that, you know, and that, but the reality is that we are seeing different, we're seeing different reactions, right? Like if some of the things that Mindy was talking about, if you could be referred for drawing on the desk at school, or maybe swearing at school or something, are we seeing different referrals for that type of behavior, or different responses to that type of behavior for different populations? And we just saw in the last, what was it, 2 weeks, a report from the Department of Justice about issues that are going on within Davis School District, and making sure that we're addressing our culture and our climate for our young people, and how they're being treated by their community of peers as well. So we do see within the juvenile justice system an overrepresentation of kids of color. And I think that we have to look at that from all sorts of things. Is that being driven by, is there something in our risk assessment tool that we need to address that might be not looking at things through, might be addressing things or identifying things in a way that isn't looking at things fairly, or how do we need to do that? But we have to constantly be pushing the envelope and trying to understand how is that happening and why is it happening? Because like I said, it's from the research, it's not showing that there's this increased level of misbehavior, but do we have a situation where we're enforcing policies differently in different arenas?
I totally agree. I even, you know, like we're always celebratory of data that, you know, in 2013, 14, there were 500 of the over 500 of those unlawful acts in a school tickets issued. And then after the reform, you know, we're down to, you know, 50 in the 50s or 60s of school-based law enforcement type situations at school. However, in those 50 to 60, whether it's in special education, whether it's in discipline data in our district, there was questions about, you know, who is still getting in trouble and for what kinds of things are they getting in trouble for, and who is still receiving the tickets, like, you know, that it does continue to persist. And I worked with, you know, 80 counselors and social workers today, and we just continued the discussion. We're reading this book. I have it sitting right here, Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity, that just kind of discusses that same thing with the wheel of, like, there's an event that happens and we rally and we try to do better, and then it kind of dies out, and then another event happens. But why is there this constant, you know, with over the last 20 years, data that does kind of remain the same in terms of, you know, kids who are having achievement gaps and getting in trouble and all of those things. I think another big piece of that is the social emotional learning, having space in every classroom for kids to connect, for teachers to connect with kids, for just these small moments of, they could be small or they could be large moments of kids being able to build those relationships with adults and with each other, so that, you know, we can reduce fighting, so that we can reduce and, you know, those types of issues that do still persist in the JJS system.
Awesome. Anybody else want to chime in on this? If not, we can move on to the next question. All right, let's do that, because we've got a lot of good audience questions, so we will have more than enough content to fill the time. So moving on to our next question. What do you believe are some of the key solutions for disrupting the school to prison pipeline?
Well, I would say,
Sorry, James, go ahead.
I would say that the solutions to disrupting school to prison pipeline, we got to start with the system itself. We got to be able to deal with that. Provide better trained. I think I mentioned this earlier, but provide opportunities for training for our resource officers, counselors, do larger collaboration opportunities for understanding the different aspects of our communities, the diverse communities. Especially nowadays, we have a number of refugees coming into our small communities and throughout the state. And if we're not better prepared, what it may look to someone as disrespect or as an issue could actually, like Mindy has mentioned earlier, these could be small behaviors that could be addressed simply by teaching, by supporting, by assisting the students learn and redirecting the misbehavior, so that way we can create positive opportunities for the student. Unless we are better prepared and trained to do that, and not make it a one-time opportunity training, 3 hours a year, 3 hours a year, or half a day a year, or a half a day every 3 years. And when an issue comes up, then you have another professional development. Unless we take it serious to where we make this as a part of our day-to-day work and weekly, I think unless we do that, then I don't think we can disrupt that. A disruption means that you have to do something drastic and significant to change the trajectory as far as the school to prison pipeline.
Pam, Mindy, Toyah, would any of you like to chime in as far as what are your thoughts on ways that we can disrupt the school to prison pipeline?
I agree with everything that James said. It's something that we strive to do in an ongoing way. But let's look at how much time and effort and money is spent to provide teachers with the time to go through this ongoing training. How is it embedded and threaded through everything that we do? And we do our best, and we do make plenty of efforts. There's always gosh, can we have more money? Can we have more training? Can we have more experts come to us? How can we do better? And the conversations are hard, and the work is hard, and they're uncomfortable conversations, as we were having them today. It takes a significant amount of self-reflection and practice and self-reflection, and it's a journey for everyone to analyze how are they treating students, how do they treat all students equitably, and if they're not, where are their shortfalls and how can they change practices. A lot of times we can do that through our data, and we talk about this data, and then we just need that time to continue to train in terms of how to improve and how to do better. But I still go back to its connection. It is that social emotional, it's that time to know your kids, to understand those circumstances, little things like checking in regarding like we did a check-in around Halloween, and just so much was learned in terms of traditions and what kids do and what happens. Those moments helped teachers understand each other better, and they help students understand each other better. Just taking that kind of time, and it could be centered around academics as well. Hey, what's my goal for this week? And then that check-in, hey, did I accomplish my goal? And kind of, accountability. We do have some classes through gang prevention and intervention. They're called Techniques for Tough Times. They're classes that are all about how do we teach self-advocacy? How do we teach problem solving? How do we just those social emotional skills? That's a specific class that's taught in middle schools and high schools. And then other social emotional learning that counselors and social workers are doing to just kind of improve skills and try to reduce these disparities. But it is that just ongoing training and self-reflection.
I have a couple of thoughts. Toyah, were you going to say something though? I thought I didn't want to cut you off. You were going to.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, I just, to follow up on that, from my perspective with disrupting it is we really just have to stop and look at what is our discipline approach with young people in schools? And to that respect, how are we resourcing our schools to change their discipline processes, right? I mean, like what I was referring to earlier, when I first started practicing in juvenile court over 20 years ago, yikes, 20 years, there, like I said, I think there was a real reliance between and it was viewed as this really great collaboration and collaborative effort where there was schools working with the courts and kind of communicating about things, and collaboration is always a good thing. But what happened is you got this over reliance on that's what our response to a problem will be. And then as we've started to change and shift practices, I think it's been really hard because we haven't really focused a lot on how do we resource our schools with what does a restorative justice practice look like? What are things to help teachers understand and recognize that they're responding to something that might be driven either through implicit or explicit biases, or how can they de-escalate versus engage in different ways, or how can we work with our school resource officers to create very, very clear boundaries about when they should be involved in situations and when they should not, and improve that training and things like that that are going on to make sure that they're engaging with students in these positive ways. And that, so to me, it's really this conversation of that we're expecting schools to change a behavior that we've really been creating since the 90s, right? I mean, it's been building and kind of been going that way for a long time. And then we're wanting to change that. And what we really need to be doing is saying, as we're changing that, let's make sure that we're effectively resourcing our schools with the types of trainings and employees and things like that that they're going to need to be able to shift the way that we're interacting with young people and families.
Thank you. Toyah, I'm going to put you on the spot. So you're the person who has personal experience here. I want to know, you know, when you were going through the adversities in your life, now looking back, what are some ways, what's some advice, what are some things that maybe would have helped you along the way and prevent you from being a part of the school to prison pipeline? In your opinion, what can be done, right, when it comes to us thinking about solutions?
Well, the thing about it though is when I was growing up, which was in the 70s, it's quite different from now. But, you know, the simple fact that the people that tried to get, because I had all kind of like, you know, big brothers and they coming out and taking me out, but they didn't speak my language. And because they didn't speak my language, we couldn't relate to each other. You know, I looked at them, I really frowned down on them. It's sad to say this, but I really frowned down on the working class people, because I admired and respected, you know, the people that was the nefarious characters in my neighborhood. And so it just wasn't relatable. But my question is, what do you guys think that could be for an 8-year-old like me that was hardened from the very start? What do you guys feel that could have been done different to help me get in a different direction? I'm just so nervous right now. This is like my first panel and I just like froze. I'm not gonna lie. I'm just being honest, because I'm sitting here and I'm listening to all these intellectuals, you know, and they're citing this and they're citing that. And all I have is real life experiences, but I haven't been able to express my experiences because, I'm froze. So I totally apologize. But that's my question what would you guys think an 8-year-old black guy, an 8-year-old black young boy that is already in the system, is already getting in trouble, what do you guys feel that you guys could have, what was the solutions to reaching me?
I think what it comes down to is relationship, understanding where you're coming from, understanding your background, and compassion, because a lot of us lack that. And when I say that is when we can't relate to your experience, to your personal experience, and to your family, where you've come from, then we lose that sense of humanness. And I think what we need to realize is how your difficulties and the difficult times you've been through are things that I may not be able to understand where you, I might not be able to know what you're going through, but I can understand it and empathize with what you're going through and help find ways to help you. And I think that's something that requires training, requires time. And I, time and time again, as a principal of an elementary school and middle school in the past, I faced, I've met with parents. They've asked for help. And I think sometimes the parents themselves don't know what to do. And I think that's where we have to be able to find the resources, have to be able to train our staff better. But then once, when we're trying to prevent and disrupt the school to prison pipeline, the school starts the process at times, but then also once they get into the system, the juvenile court system, that process in itself, it's another layer of difficulty, because once they have a charge, they go to another court, and then they go back out, and then they go to court again, and then again and again. And so by the time the student comes back to us, that student may have missed 30 to 40 days already, and they're so far behind. And whether you do home detention, whether you do JJS, whatever it may be, I think the challenge we face is across the board. You've got to be able to take a look at our resource officers, the juvenile court system, how they work with students, and the types of sentencings that they do, the number of days. Is it, are they taking a look at what they're doing with regards to incarceration and all that? So all the way across the board, the system has to be taken a look at. But I do, going back to your question, Toyah, I think we have to be compassionate and understand where families are coming from.
Yeah, thank you.
I would also just say, I think to your point, like what would have helped is, I think in a lot of ways, when I listen to it, it's exactly what you're talking about. It's credible messengers, right? And this is something it's interesting. I was just at a meeting with Juvenile Justice Services and Salt Lake County the other day talking about some issues. And this is a program that the Division of Juvenile Justice Services is looking at. And it's something that we all really need to be cognizant of, is like a young person like you're talking about, Mr. Reynolds, an 8-year-old Black boy in that community. And then we're like, here, come talk to this, come talk to Pam, this white lady. It's like, we've got to be able to find people that do have lived experiences or lived like within the community experiences, and that people feel like they can identify and that they can connect with, to actually make that emotional connection, to have mentors that are steering you towards this type of behavior versus like what the people that you felt comfortable with in your community, right? With where the badge of honor, the rite of passage type situation. And so it, to me, is it also included in a conversation of, as those of it, like with my office, we're always looking at how do you look at diversity and inclusion, right? We need to have defense attorneys that are working with young people in the system that look like and reflect the community that we're serving. We need to be cognizant of those things within our schools, with counselors, with the young people with the people that we're engaging to work with our young people, so that young people feel comfortable and like that they can identify with the person that's reaching out to them. Because the other thing to keep in mind is that the court system can get involved, but ultimately the court system steps out. So the goal really is to say, how do we connect a young 8-year-old who's struggling with their community, so that as the court system steps out, there's still a community of support for that young person, right? Versus we've stepped out and now you're on your own, but we piled on a bunch of stuff, but now we're out. Good luck to you, right? So I think it's building those types of communities and those types of supports within communities, so that we realize that we have this incident, but then when we're out, there's still this other support there.
And I would
Yeah.
also just
Well,
add identifying your strengths. just oh, sorry, Toyah, just like what were you into as a kid? Like, could we have like gotten you into like whatever it's like, sometimes it's just through that PYP program that we have, it's just providing experiences. Those protective factors tend to be sports, tend to be, academics, tend to be something that like saying, hey, you have this skill set as an 8-year-old, how can we capitalize? How can we like give you a place to shine in the classroom with the strengths that you bring to the table?
Yeah. Well, me personally, I had both sides of what you're talking about because, I was a very gifted athlete all my life. I started at 7 years old. But what I want to say, if I would have had somebody come to me that was just like me or understood me and said, hey, look, and paint a picture of the direction my life was leading right there, of all the things that, the pain and just missing out, having your life taken away and all that stuff, just missing so much by running in and out of incarcerations or through addiction or whatnot ever. If I would have had somebody come to me at that pivotal moment in my childhood, I might have made some better decisions. That's the one thing that I know is that a lot of people don't know what they're getting into. And once they're in, they're so deep, not to say that anybody can't climb out, but chances are they're so conditioned and it's so deeply seated, they don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. And so, like I said, if I would have had that, then maybe, things could have been different, but I believe that everybody has a choice because there has been a lot of people that has been in worse situations than I have, and they turned out good, but at the same time, you gotta understand that when you're not as developed as, other people, you have a tendency to, not have the confidence, not understand things the way it should be understood, to assimilate it in the right way.
It just absolutely, I mean, it's horrifying to think of you as an 8-year-old being incarcerated or going through a juvenile justice system. I don't, choice at 8 is, like I just hope that, I hope that we have better systems in place to support kids, because I'm so sorry for that experience and that happened, and you're amazing. And it's, and when you said, oh, I froze or whatever, you are exactly who the schools need to hear from. You are exactly who kids need to see, so my hope is that we can do more of that, because that's where it's at. You are the stakeholder. You are the person. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, I want to
appreciate
echo that, Toyah. Like, we interviewed you on live television about your life, and you were spectacular. You are still to this day one of our favorite guests that we've ever brought onto the show. And I want you to know that, like, your perspective here in this panel is vital. Like, we can't just have all professionals here. We need the person with the personal experience here to be a part of this conversation. And so, I understand. I understand why this type of environment can be uncomfortable at first, but I just want to say that you're doing awesome. We are absolutely enjoying hearing from you. And it reminds me of how many of my childhood friends who are still my friends to this day, told me that their 5th grade teacher, their counselor, told them they would never graduate from high school, told them they would never amount to anything. And it just perplexes me that an educator would ever say something like that to their student, no matter how bad their student was struggling or acting out. And I know I'm just a moderator, but I grew up around many of my peers who, went through the school to prison pipeline. And I just wish that a lot of the professionals that were around us would understand that Sometimes misbehavior is just a projection of a deeper problem that's going on at home. Like my peers who were shoplifting, they didn't have food to eat at home. You know, my peers who were joining gangs, they didn't have a sense of community and family at home. You know, my peers who were becoming the class clown, you know, who were acting out against teachers and thinking that was a cool way to make friends, making people laugh. They just felt lonely. They wanted a sense of belonging. And so I'm hearing, you know, all of our great panelists talking about that importance of understanding, right? That importance of connection. And it's like they're preaching to the choir. And so thank you so much for such an engaging conversation. The last hour has flown by, and it's actually time for us to answer a few audience Q&As. And so we've got so many great ones. I don't think we can get to all of them, but I am going to just randomly pick a couple. I'm going to pose them, and whoever wants to jump in, feel free to jump in. Our first audience Q&A that I'm going to pose is from Kristen Estrades. So Kristen asks, are there any ideas, options for peer-to-peer mentor type situations in our schools? I have a child at East High, and it is my experience that the cultural and racial divides are enormous in schools. How can we blur those lines and have people from different backgrounds and races support each other?
My hope again is just going back to that social emotional learning and providing those spaces within the classroom. Because we can do that. We can have time and space for kids to be able to connect and see each other. That Techniques for Tough Times class is intentionally enrolled so that kids can connect with each other. There's so much work to be done around that topic. And I do think, like, you know, parents reaching out and through their school community councils and things like that, I can pass this message along to the school administrators and the school counselors. And, you know, we can check and see how can we create more space, whether it's at lunchtime or after school or within the classrooms, because it's, you know, we know that it can support kids.
I would just add to that too, that I think just what we were talking about with Toyah, right? I think we need to be really intentional with who we're engaging as our mentors and making sure that we're looking for individuals that are going to be able to connect with our young people and identify with our young people, and really making sure that we're helping to make those connections, because young people aren't going to just make those. I mean, I have this 7-year-old kid and I'm like, you got to go retake the math test, right? And she's like, okay, I'll go sign up for the math test. She's terrified. She's not going to talk to the teacher about the math test. So then I email the teacher. I'm like, she's got to retake the math test. And then the teacher says, she's got to come talk to me. I'm like, she's 12. She's not going to approach you on her own. She should, I agree. I want her to be that person, but that's not who she is. And so, and imagine then if you're adding to that, the things that are posed in the question, right? Like those racial and cultural boundaries and things like that. And so we need to be very intentional that we're identifying people and putting people in our schools that can mentor and work with our young people, that are people that our young people are going to feel comfortable approaching, feel comfortable talking to, feel comfortable confiding in.
All right, our next question is from Nikki Norton. Nikki asks, how do we get white people to understand racism better when we've seen so much resistance to this type of education?
Well, I'll just jump in and say, as a white person, I just think we have to keep talking about it, right? I mean, I think the problem is that people are so fearful of like being you've done something wrong or being called out or something, instead of saying it is a conversation, we need to have it, we need to own it, we need to be honest about it, and we need to learn how we can do better. And so I just think making sure that that even when it's uncomfortable, that we talk, that we continue to communicate. And I think that I mean, I really, at the end, that's what I think, is that we're just really going to only be able to do that through making sure that even though people are uncomfortable in the space, that we don't stop the conversation, that we say, we understand we're uncomfortable, we're going to have to push forward. We got to keep talking about this. We got to keep moving forward. We got to keep recognizing, why are we all so uncomfortable? Why does talking about this make us all so uncomfortable? We need to ask those hard questions. And like I said, just be willing to like push those issues and push those boundaries to say that we're not going to change behaviors unless we can identify them, identify how and why they happened, and be comfortable about talking about solutions.
I would have to agree with you, Pam. I think that our focus should always be educating people and not having conflicts with maybe the rhetoric that happens back and forth. I think our focus should be education, educating our students, our parents, and also, you know, when the situation of talking about these issues becomes uncomfortable, the only way we can resolve issues, we know there will always be resistance, but I think what we can do is continue the conversation to become better citizens, to become civil with one another, and to understand one another. And I think only through that understanding we can make changes. We may not all change a few, but I think we can change many.
I agree. And just a shout out again to just that time and space for the ongoing training. And that it's embedded, that it's not just a day, like you were saying, James, it's not a day event. It's, you know, we're talking about it in staff meeting, we're talking about it when we're evaluating data, and it's training for people to be able to have those conversations within their school buildings and within their staff meetings. You know, yeah, it really does require the investment. It's always a shout out to legislators. Hey, more money. It's always helpful.
All right, I'm kind of jumping around in the Q&A just to spice things up, keep the audience on the edge. Is my question going to be asked? Is it not? You know, that way, if you're going in order, they don't know whether or not their question will be asked or skipped. So our next question comes from Aurora Green. Aurora says, really appreciate Toyah's perspective. What hiring initiatives are Utah schools taking to ensure students have someone they can relate to or who speaks their language, as Toyah so importantly pointed out? So maybe this is a question for Mindy and James, maybe?
I know we have initiatives through the state, you know, the Utah Board of Education. It's called a Grow Your Own, and it's essentially like scholarship programs. There are scholarship programs for students to become teachers. There are scholarships as well for paraprofessionals from the community to go to get teachers licenses and counseling licenses and things like that. Specifically to HR, I would have to invite our executive director to HR. I know that you know, people are always looking for counselors who are multilanguage, you know, speakers who relate to and are graduates of Salt Lake City School District. Like, that's the ideal employee, right? People who have grown up in our town. And but like, I hate to speak too directly to initiatives without having our HR director here, but maybe James could add.
Yeah, I would like to say that across the board, we are experiencing one of the hardest employment situations in the state of Utah. We're short with substitutes. We're short with paraeducators, group leaders. And we are actively, every day, we are making an extra effort to look for anyone who wants to work in education and contribute. And, you know, if you're looking, and I'm just going to plug this in, Salt Lake City School District is hiring paraeducators, substitutes, teachers, and to just look for those schools. And if you want to make a difference, obviously, please join any of the school districts statewide. I know that there's a great opportunity there for you to be a mentor, a leader, someone that you can relate to. Any of you can, anyone who's willing to work in that capacity can be a mentor. As a matter of fact, our paraeducators, we were doing some training today with several of our employees, and we talked about the power in you, or the power in one, meaning that each and every one of us have the power to make a difference at whatever level, the custodian, the cook, the paraeducator. So all of those things are significant. And we hope that anyone that's willing to work will apply for any of the districts statewide, because we have a shortage all the way across the board.
Could I just also throw in, let's look to our kids. Let's look to the kids in our schools. And, we might have had a young person that was struggling that now is doing really well, that now can be a mentor to another student that they maybe can identify with. Kids rise in those situations. They thrive in situations where they are sharing their experiences in positive ways with other young people. And so how can we look back into the students within our schools and say, how can we help you? And now you're in a better and a more positive place. How can we help you help this other student? And how can we create a culture of support amongst the students within our schools, both with students that are of their same race and ethnicity that they identify with, but across those boundaries as well. But there's a lot of support and there's a lot of strength with our kids if we can figure out how to tap into that.
All right, our next question is from Carl Bechtold. Carl, I apologize if I said your last name wrong. Carl says, I've been a student and then a teacher for a few years, about a half century ago. Being unruly would get a student disciplined. This was intended to keep bad behavior from disrupting school and the school society from being distracted. How does one balance trying to help students with behavioral problems versus a peaceful and productive environment?
Sorry, I found his question, so I'm reading Carl's question, and some
of these questions are very detailed. I'm impressed, but it's one of those questions you kind of have to hear it again.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I think what we know is that, and that's why restorative practices are so important, because students getting disciplined doesn't work, right? And it doesn't work for, it might work for the small group of students, but we know that it doesn't have the outcomes that we want it to have, like hence all of these different reports that, we've been referencing. Truly, that approach of understanding the harm that was caused and understanding how to repair harm. Sometimes, kids might even understand, oh my gosh, I caused all this harm, I'm embarrassed, but I just don't know what to do. And providing space for kids to be able to re-enter communities, re-enter classrooms, and have processes that allow them to take accountability, to understand and be accountable to their peers and to whomever the harm was caused. It truly is more of a peaceful classroom. And people are learning skills and in forgiveness and taking accountability. And then when you know better, you do better. Having those types of opportunities within the school system.
All right, thank you, Mindy. Next question is from Michelle Kelly. Michelle says, and panelists, feel free to take a second to find Michelle's question in the Q&A tab. So Michelle asks, we also have the school to morgue pipeline, as those who graduate from high school on average live 10 years longer than those who don't graduate. And they had a few references cited in there. Further, lifespan increases by each additional year of higher education, and underrepresented groups are not as likely to attain college degrees, thereby adding to the excess burden of mortality borne by the poor and people of color. So panel, do you think these facts are part of a bigger picture of marginalization from unequal and or non-responsive educational opportunities?
When I see those facts, I'll just go for it. Please interrupt me if you have something to say. I'm just like, I think of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences studies, and that study was all about the medical impacts of trauma, the medical impacts of exactly what you've just described, like how these outcomes and health and life outcomes can be better. So when I was at Horizonte, we always talked about, success incurs more success. Once a student has a successful experience, then they're more likely to try it again. They're more likely to do more. In terms of graduation, I worked with the adult education program as well. And we had programs in adult probation and parole. We are going to have a brand new prison within our school district. So there's going to be a lot of adulthood opportunities there as well. I think making sure that within all of those systems, we have opportunities for success, opportunities for education, and education about the impacts that trauma has. I think talking to teachers and talking to social workers, the first time you learn about ACEs, you're like, oh my gosh, well, that's why I have this many ACEs, or, oh, I know that, I know this kid in my classroom and he probably has a lot of these ACEs. So it just helps understand that a place where we can hopefully intervene and change that trajectory, because our brains are flexible. We have neuroplasticity. We can build these synapses and change directories. The more that we understand like that medical connection to lifespan and trauma, and we just continue to try to learn more about that, including our school nurses in these conversations and counselors and social workers.
I would also add to, we know that research has shown that, students, if they're thinking about going to four-year college, want to get a four-year college degree, or they want to go get an apprenticeship, going to an apprenticeship program makes a significant difference in their lives. I think opportunities for more education certainly has a profound impact lifelong, so I think the more we educate, the support them, provide them these opportunities early in life with job shadowing, concurrent enrollment classes in high school, so they can see the potential. They can be apprentices they can be electricians, they can be a number of different, it doesn't have to be a four-year college degree, but what's important is providing opportunities for them, providing opportunities where they can learn, and also making sure that they understand that there's a place for them at every level. And so I think those are it does make an impact in their lives. And I appreciate that question, because I think those are the types of things and questions we need to think about long term, what's the impact?
All right, next up, we have a question from Renee Athay. Again, Renee, I'm so sorry if I said your last name wrong. Renee asks, is there a program for the adults interfacing with young folks to be trained in social emotional learning so that they can adjust their mindsets and engage differently? Teachers, administrators, police, civic leaders.
Our district does engage in social emotional learning. We do have curriculum that's K through 12. We're even probably in our pre-K programs as well. And each of the schools might implement a little bit differently. Sometimes it's very counselor-led. In other schools, it's very teacher-led. But building that common vocabulary, continuing to build that common skill set in terms of how do we deal with stress. We have a program called Inner Explorer where kids learn mindfulness. We have mindfulness-based stress reduction classes for educators as well. And then we have a SEL framework that's on our website that also goes through, it's aligned with CASEL, which is an organization all about social emotional learning. And in it is a K-12 map of what are we hoping and what are we working with kids to be able to do on that social emotional spectrum. That's all the way through. You can find it on the educational, if you go to the EESS website, it's at the Educational Equity and Student Services website. We have a social emotional learning director, and she works with schools regarding that curriculum as well.
All right, let's take a question from Beverly Hawkins. Beverly asks, what role can peer courts or other student supports play in building necessary relationships with students?
I feel like I'm taking so much airtime, but all of these things tend to be under my umbrella. And Pam, I know you have information, regarding that as well, but we do work with the Salt Lake Peer Court, and we do refer students to Peer Court. It's been an awesome transition over Zoom. We have amazing student mentors, and actually Zoom has kind of made it like that much more accessible to students and families, and it is a voluntary process. Our school administrators, school counselors, social workers, school resource officers can opt to utilize Peer Court. And for families, it's voluntary. And it does kind of create that mentor experience for students as well. So we've had a long history with Peer Court, and appreciate the things that it can bring to the table.
Peer courts are something that got discussed a lot during 2017 when the report was looked at, that Mindy referenced very early in the program, where we basically looked at all of Utah data and identified where we had problems within our juvenile justice system and how were there ways that we could address some of them. And peer courts were identified as one thing that schools could use as kind of an alternative based discipline or an alternative intervention or an alternative resource, whatever we want to call it, right, to referrals to court or suspensions or expulsions and things like that. What I love about the peer court model is just that, is getting kids connected to each other to be mentors to each other. They could be in a situation where they can be successful, and then they can turn around and help other students be successful. I will be honest, I'm not totally in love with the idea that what we're doing is trying to say, let's stop relying on the courts. So what we're going to do is instead have pretend court in school, instead of having, I wish sometimes that, and that's not a knock on peer courts, because they've, like Mindy said, they've done really great work in this space and things like that. But I would like us to see expanding that outside of pretend court within that situation to really what we're trying to get at, which is how can we create a space where students need some type of an intervention or need some type of a resource, and they come into this space and then they build on that and can turn around and give back. And I'm not knocking that model. It's just, like I said, like, if we're creating a space where we're saying courts aren't always the answer, so then we're like, okay, we'll create a little another court in school instead of sending, anyway. And that's not it. That's not the basis of it. The peer court structure model is very different. And like I said, I like that connection of the students to each other. I think that's really important. I just like to see us expand the idea or what the basis of that could be.
Well, with the peer court, for many years I used that as an administrator, because I felt that the impact that I was making through peers was more significant to the families and to the students. And rather, for example, if you have a student nowadays, if you have a refugee student that's on temporary visa, refugee visa, and they have a misdemeanor before they turn 18, that could actually, depending on the situation, if they have 2 misdemeanors, based on those cases, they could actually take away their refugee status. And that's one of the things that we have to also understand is, like, it's real easy to have students be given a citation and send them to court, but at the end of the day, the immigration court thinks differently. Immigration court is completely, they won't even listen to the juvenile court. It's a different court system. So for me, when I was working across the board with students, I was saying, let's use this preventative method before they even get into the system. And because either way, when they go to the courts, guess what they're going to do? They're going to do restitution. What do they do with peer court? They do restitution. So one has a record, one doesn't. One is prevention, one is consequence. And so I think we have to keep that in mind, is that the power of the justice system. And if we want to, a minute ago, we asked the question, how do we disrupt that? We disrupt by thinking outside the box, by doing something different. And I think that's, I like what peer court does. I strongly recommend for all other districts to replicate that, because I think it's one way of addressing that need.
Thank you, panelists, so much. We have to wrap. We have about less than 3 minutes, but I do want to direct one last question to Toyah, and Toyah, feel free to keep this short. We've gotten so many great comments, by the way, for you, Toyah. We're going to compile them in an email and then send them to you. We just want to know, Toyah, what do you think about all of these ideas that have been discussed? Do they make you feel hopeful? Are we missing anything?
I've received a lot of information, and I just know that I have to start being more active about, if I plan on being involved with these panels and things like that, I have to educate. I got a lot of education because I'm like a fish out of water. So, but it has had an impact, and just sitting here listening to the things that was spoken over today, it just helps me see just how far we got to go. There's a lot of progress going on, but in me as an individual, I have to grow a lot too. And it's because of you guys, and I appreciate, all your opinions and things like that, and just bearing with me, so thank you. It's been very informative for me.
Thank you, Toyah. And I think we can all agree that we are all constantly learning from each other. We're all, right, fighting the good fight in different ways, whether it's social justice, right, like racial equity, women's rights, LGBTQ issues, education, COVID-19 disparities. We're all fighting the good fight together, and we're always learning from one another. Thank you to everybody. That is our time. So I would like to wrap. First off, I would like to thank all of our panelists. You all have been incredible. Mindy Holmdahl, Pamela Vickery, James Yapias, Toyah Reynolds. Thank you so much for spending time with us tonight and sharing your insight with us. I would also like to thank our sponsors, the incredible organizations that are behind the event today. We've got the League of Women Voters of Salt Lake, Better Utah Institute, NAACP Salt Lake Branch, as well as the ACLU of Utah. And thank you to all of you who tuned in and joined us for the discussion tonight. We've got about 40 to 50 people who are tuning in live via Zoom, and I know there's probably more on Facebook, and then more who will be watching this discussion after the fact. So we appreciate you for joining us. Thank you so much, and have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.